Hi, I'm SanathaVihari Losangeles, and you're listening to Catholic versus Buddhist.
Tell the audience a little bit about yourself, if you would, please. Who you are, what you believe, and why you believe it.
All right, sounds good. Well, my name is Venerable Losangeles SanathaVihari. That is a mouthful, so people just call me Bante. I'm from Los Angeles, California. And I was in the military, in the Air Force Reserve for 11 years. During that time, I came across Buddhism. I was just looking for meditation. Then I came across one particular teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji Mahatera. And he had a different perspective on the teachings, a more modern approach to the teachings, going back to the original teachings, pushing aside or suspending the tradition for a moment and just looking at the original text. And that really caught my attention. So the meditation itself, through experiential knowledge, totally changed my life. I was in the military, I was just like any young guy. I like to have fun and do all these other things. And I lived a beautiful life and I don't regret anything. But I really had to see how far the rabbit hole went down. So that's how I became a Buddhist monk.
Can you talk just a little bit about your ethnic background, what your parents believed, what your grandparents believed, what sort of religious upbringing you might have had, if any?
My mother, she was from a small town in Zacatecas in Mexico. And she grew up in a very traditional Catholic family. And my father, he grew up in a Catholic setting, but when he was 17, he went off to the Marine Corps, and then he never went back to his hometown, really, just to visit here and then. So he lived in big cities. So he was Catholic, but he would go to any kind of a Christian church, and he wouldn't, really stick to any one kind of religion, like dogmatically or have it as his worldview. He kind of let everyone do what he wanted, but definitely he had an overall Catholic taste to everything. And when I was small, my grandma was really strict. So, I did everything Catholic that I had to do. I was baptized. I did my first communion. My first communion was done by my cousin, who was a missionary in Africa. He's still there, actually. He's a very nice guy. He's awesome. He's doing great work out there. And that experience of having my cousin do it for me was like the best thing. Like, I remember being a child and my cousin's the ones doing it. And I don't know, it felt great. So it was like one of my best memories that I have of when I was a Catholic. For the last 20 years, he's been in Africa doing work. So I feel very proud about him.
Do you remember being very young and believing in God and praying at night and that sort of thing? At least having a faith, even if it was naive?
Yeah, so to me, it was more like I couldn't distinguish between like religion and culture and philosophy or whatever. So this is what we do. So that's what we do. And I felt like there was some sort of connection. I don't know if I could comprehend, what God was, but I felt some sort of connection with something. I felt the sanctity of when I went into the church. I knew it was a holy place. I knew the priests were spiritual people. So I didn't have a clear-cut understanding of it, but I understood that it was something special and meaningful.
Was there a time where you were anti-religious? Did you go through a dark period like that?
Actually, I went through a personal dark period, but I never projected that on religion. I went through like an agnostic period where I was skeptical about everything. I had a lot of doubts about God, but I couldn't bring myself to deny that there was something there. So, I think that's as further as I got. I was just like an agnostic.
Buddhism doesn't acknowledge God, but it doesn't really deny God either. What is your understanding of the role of God in Buddhism?
Each school of Buddhism probably has a different view. I really guide myself by the early texts of the Buddha, just like the monk who inspired me. What I understand from those teachings, it's just like what you said. So it doesn't really acknowledge a creator God. It doesn't deny one. It's not really focused on that. There's talks about God. So they talk about like the Indian God, who is supposed to be the creator God, Mahabrahma, the great Brahma. And the Buddha has interactions with him. The Buddha is like teaching Brahma what he doesn't know. That's actually one discourse, what Brahma didn't know, what God didn't know. And then actually in one discourse, God kind of tells the Buddha or one of his disciples that people on earth shouldn't be upset with him because he's trying his best to keep everyone happy, but he can't do everything. So then Buddha comes and tells people that, and, Buddha kind of takes a soft approach on God. He's not critical of God. he's kind of like his mentor and teacher, but it does, you really have to look to see where God's at in there. And that's the Indian God. It's not the Abrahamic God. So
yeah, just to be clear so the audience knows, the Abrahamic God is perfect and there's no lack of knowledge or lack of perfection in our God, just to make sure that that's understood. But what does your name mean, that Buddhist name that you took on? Did you choose it or was it given to you? And what do the different parts of it mean?
The name was given to me by the chief abbot, who was my preceptor, who was my teacher. So everything in Buddhism within the monks community has to be brought to a vote. So nothing's done without a vote. So the monks in the temple got together, they thought about names, they voted on one, and then my teacher gave it to me. In Sri Lanka, at least, they have the tradition that one part of your name has to be where you're from, so they can identify you, because there's so many monks by the same, they have the same name. There's only so many names you can choose. So they pick where you're from. So they called me Los Angeles because I'm from LA. And then SanathaVihari. So Vihari is like the same word that they use for dwelling, Vihara. So dwelling, Sanatha, like Atta, means like self or person. So Sa adds to kind of like the person who dwells in this dwelling. And usually when they talk about Vihara or Vihari, they're talking about some sort of divine dwelling. Originally, like in original Pali and Sanskrit, that's not what it meant, but throughout the times it's been synonymous with divine dwelling. So the one who is protected by the divine dwelling, or the one who dwells in divine dwelling, something like that.
I'd like to change gears a little bit and sort of talk about morality, because it's something that's always on my mind with everyone that I talk with. I'm deeply troubled and disturbed by any religion that says that everyone ends up in heaven. And Buddhism, it seems to me, says that everyone is one person. There's only the one mind of Buddhism, and that everything is illusion. You and I are not two separate beings. That's illusion. That's Maya. And the ultimate reality is only the one mind of Buddha. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the ultimate happy ending is being reunited in Nirvana or in Buddha or something to that effect, which I would equate with perfect bliss and eternal happiness. So from my perspective, that seems to say that there's only God, there's only heaven, and suffering is illusion, and therefore it doesn't really matter what we do. Eventually, the illusion will dissolve and we'll go back to being that one mind of Buddha. Can you please correct me where I'm wrong in my interpretation?
So you're correct. That idea was picked up by particular schools, but when we look at the early Buddhist literature, you don't see that kind of a view there. So there isn't like this one mind that connects everything. Everyone doesn't end up going to heaven. That stuff's not there in the early literature.
Basically, what I want to know is there a difference between the best case scenario of what's possible and the worst case scenario of what's possible? And I ask all of my guests this sort of question. And I'd like to have your perspective from your particular brand of Buddhism. What does it say about the best case scenario or the worst case scenario for someone like me or someone like you? Are we one or are we two? And what's the best and what's the worst?
So the traditional view, as I understand it, is that there are several different planes of existence. There's three main divisions. There's like the material world with which you live in. There's like the non-form world or imageless world. And then there's the hells. And within those, there's different varieties and categories of hells. If you do really, really, really good actions, then you will go to these heavenly material realms. So within the material realms, there's heavenly realms. And then the highest heavenly realms are the immaterial realms. But if you do bad actions, you might be born in the material world with bad consequences. Or you might be born as another being in the material world that doesn't have, the intellectual capacity that we do to solve problems and fix ourselves. Or if you do really bad things, you could end up as a hungry ghost or different forms of like bad states of being. Or you can end up in hell. Or if you kill a Buddha, an enlightened being, your mother or your father, you go to the deepest hell, which is called the Avicii hell, and you stay there for many universal cycles. So you stay there for not only this universe, but many more. Once your bad karma runs out, then you go out, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to come back to the human world. So that person, once their karma's done, they might even just go to like a lesser hell and stay in that lesser hell and go through all the hells until they come back to a human form. Or they might go from that hell to a human form or from that hell to an animal form. It's very difficult to tell because there's so many variables. We really can't tell. It's very individually based on each person's karma.
Does this process end?
No, unless you become awakened to the dream of existence. That means you become a Buddha, an enlightened being, an awakened being. Then it ends. But if you do good things, if you're the best person, best possible person you could ever be in existence, then you will become the greatest God in the highest heaven. And you'll stay there for many universes, countless eons. We can't even imagine it. But eventually your karma will run out.
I don't really see any motivation to not explore every nook and cranny of this complex karmic system. I want to lift every rock. I want to look behind every tree. I want to indulge in every good and every evil and just map out the whole complex system. And I have all of eternity apparently to do it if that's the case. I see morality as hinging and depending on a fixed eternal outcome, such as I have in Catholicism. I have heaven or hell and you can't get out.
The Buddha said that all beings are seeking happiness and pleasure, and all beings have aversion towards pain and suffering. So that alone would deter them from even going to hell, even if it's only for like one universe cycle, which who knows how many billions of years that would be or trillions of years. No one wants that kind of stuff. So that is the deterrent.
It sounds like what you're saying is that we have a human nature and that we are built to work with goodness and to be good for goodness sake. And this would explain the conscience that we have. Is there a Buddhist explanation for the conscience, that little voice in our head that says, no, don't do that?
Well, the Buddha says something like the mind in its natural state is luminous and clear. So he doesn't say like good or bad, but he says that it's luminous and clear. When we get into like the deeper teachings, it kind of goes into like non-dual kind of concepts.
What is the goal of Buddhism, and is Buddhism better at arriving at that goal than any other Eastern religion, and why?
Most religions, everyone wants to go to heaven and they want to be with God. That's the outcome, right? That's not the Buddhist idea. The Buddhist idea is to get out of samsara, to get out of cyclical rebirth and dying, to escape it. So actually to step out of the system. So heaven and hell and all of them are within the system. And you step out of the system, kind of like you're Neo in the Matrix or something. Another way to understand it is that you realize that existence itself was a self-imposed prison or house that you put yourself in. And you realize that you never existed in the way you think you existed. So there's no one to die and there was no one to be born. Everything's kind of like ephemeral. It's kind of like where you get into this whole thing when you talk about illusion. But these kind of words like illusion and delusion are like, there's not exact parallels to them in Buddhism, but it's something like that. So we're actually trying to step out of this whole system of heaven and hell and earth and all these things. Eventually in Buddhism, they talk about ultimate reality and conventional reality. But in the original Buddhist teachings, I have never found the Buddha use words like ultimate and conventional realities or different realities. He says there is only one reality. So this kind of like transcendent aspect is within this reality. People just have to be able to see it and they'll realize like, oh, this was just a simulation and I was just a simulation. I'm just a component of different functions of the mind and the body working together. And it gives off this like holographic experience where I think that I'm here doing these things.
Is Buddhism and is your particular form of Buddhism better than the other Eastern religions? And if so, why?
If your goal is to step out of the universe, step out of yourself, then what the Buddha taught would be the most efficient way. But for those people who want to be with God, I mean, Buddhism has no problem with that. I mean, who are we to tell you what's the best way to get there?
Are you saying that the goal of Hinduism and Sikhism is to be with the one God?
As far as I understand it, yes.
Okay, and that God is different from the one mind of Buddha that was adopted and adapted by Buddhism later.
So what happened is, over hundreds of years, Buddhist religion started incorporating the local aspects of Indian religion. And that's how you get these whole ideas about the one Buddha mind and all of these. These are really just imports for convenience for whatever time that Buddhism found itself in. So it incorporated all these things from whatever was around at that time.
Can you think of an example of an organized religion that is pointing people in the wrong direction? Is there a lateral movement that could be brought to people by a philosophy or a religion? And is there a religion that could possibly bring people down?
I think there is the possibility, or there might be religions out there that could bring people towards unwholesome states of being, to hell, to destructive states, painful states. So anyone who's doing good things is progressing, regardless of whatever religion they are. So on that level, we would say that all religions that are promoting charity and morals and brotherhood, fraternity, and all these kind of good things, they're progressing. But if we take what the Buddha is telling us to be true, that this goes on forever, then according to the Buddhist early teachings, you would want to step out of it. So if we take that kind of worldview from the Buddhists that you want to step out of it, then I think we would sort of get kind of this like horizontal kind of thing you were talking about with all the other religions that are doing good, but they're kind of like, it's going on forever. So it kind of goes sideways. They're not going up or down on that level. But on the level, like here on, like in samsara itself, they are going up within these levels, but they're not stepping out. So it would kind of be like a lateral.
Okay, I see. Now I want to talk about something controversial, especially within the Catholic Church, and that's sexual morality. What is the Buddhist perspective generally, and in particular in your school of Buddhism? What is the teaching about sexuality and morality?
Well, the Buddha was actually very strict on this matter, especially with monks and nuns. There's no funny business. You can't even be alone with a member of the opposite sex, or you can't receive things from them hand to hand. And with the monks and nuns, very strict. But with the lay people, it says, Ka mesu micha chara veremani sikapadam samadhiyami. I will not abuse sensuality. The Buddha says you cannot have a relationship with someone who is under guardianship of their mom, of their dad, of their brother, of their sister, of the government, unless you get permission from who's ever in charge of them. In ancient India, that would require for you to get married with them. So there shouldn't be any relationships outside of marriage, as I understand it in the traditional teachings.
Is it frowned upon to create more people because these people then are trapped in this material world?
No, because regardless if you have people or not, they would just find some sort of other vehicle to get into. But being in the human form itself is what the Buddha says is like the middle place. So even though like there's other beings in this material plane, like animals, insects, bacteria, but the human condition with the possibility to, go up and go down, other beings that are beneath us, it's very difficult for them to progress because they lack like the intellect or cognitive abilities to make judgments on moral judgments. So they get stuck where they're at. And the ones who are above in heaven, well, they're blissed out. They're having a party. So they're not really concerned about trying to make new good karma and stuff like that.
We pray to the saints because they can help us. Do you have a similar mechanism?
There isn't a praying per se where we ask anything because the Buddha is gone and all the Buddhist saints, the arahants, that's what they're called, the awakened beings, they're all gone too. So there's no one to pray to begin with. But as we all know, people left to their own devices will do anything. So people do pray to the Buddha, and eventually in other Buddhist schools, Buddha is still around, or there's other Buddhas that are around and people pray to them.
Now, Buddha has enough karma to be up in heaven, one of the highest heavens probably, you would say, for quite a long time, probably for many iterations of the universe, right?
He had that potential, and he was in a very high heaven. I think it's called the Tavatimsa or the Tusita heaven, one of those two heavens. He was in one of those heavens before he came here to earth to become awakened, because this is the ideal state for awakening. But after he became the Buddha, before that he was Prince Siddhartha. He wasn't the Buddha, he was just a regular person like everyone else. When he became the Buddha, then he stepped out of existence himself. So heaven, hell, all these things do not apply to him because he realized that there is no him there. He went away. He's not subject to the kind of understanding that we have of the world, heaven and hell.
Oh, and that's a permanent condition? I can't remember if you told me it was permanent or not.
I can't say it's permanent or impermanent, but the Buddha does say that it's unconditioned. It's an unconditional state.
Okay. So if it's permanent, then he will always be out of the experience, out of this, you call it samsara?
Samsara, yeah, cyclical birth.
Does that umbrella of samsara, does that cover every heaven and every hell and everything in between?
Yes, everything in existence.
Okay. And you can step outside of that, and that's what Buddha did, allegedly?
Yes.
How much certainty do we have that he did that?
Well, the Buddha always told us this. find out for yourselves. There's a very famous sutra. It's like probably the most butchered sayings of the Buddha. The Buddha says, don't take something on tradition. Don't take it because it's your teacher. Don't take it because it's like passed down through culture, all these things. But only after you've thoroughly analyzed it and practiced it and seen that it's good for you, then take it as your teaching. So the Buddha is really telling you, like, come and try it and tell me what you get. And if you think it's good, then take that as truth because it works. So the way it would work like this, how we know if the Buddha really achieved that, is by practicing ourselves. And if we progress on the path and we get stages that kind of mirror what the Buddha was saying, then we can take that as pragmatic truth that Buddha was right upon his ultimate final conclusion, because the first steps are correct also.
Now, I want to change gears a little bit and talk about love. In my religion, God is love, and love is the central teaching of the church. We need to love God for his own sake, and we need to love neighbor and ourselves for God's sake. So how does that view compare and contrast with the Buddhist view, where we're not supposed to desire anything? Can you talk a little bit about love from your Buddhist perspective?
Yeah, so what you said, we're not supposed to desire anything, that's like another Buddhist meme that's been butchered.
Okay.
So when the Buddha talks about desire, he talks about 3 particular kinds of desires that we're not supposed to have. He gives that in his first sermon called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the turning of the wheel of Dharma, setting in motion the wheel of Dharma. He says there's 3 kinds of desires that we shouldn't have. The word desire is tangha, which really comes from thirst. So it's not like the kind of desire that we have, that we think about in the West, or craving. It kind of means something like an urge. So we have the urge for kamma tangha, which sensual experiences. We want to see things, we want to hear things, we want to taste things. That's one desire that we have. The other one is bhava tangha, the urge to exist, to become. That's what keeps us going through existence. One of the forces that keeps us going through samsara, because we never want to die. We want to keep living. Even if it's in heaven, after we die, we want to go somewhere else. And the last one is vibhava tangha. Vibhava tangha means annihilation, that you want to commit suicide, that you don't want to exist at all. You have an aversion towards existence. So the Buddha said, straying away from sensuality, straying away from wanting to exist, and straying away from not wanting to exist. I have found the middle path. So now I'll go back to your question about love. Can I get some clarification about love? Because you know how we use it in the West. It's like, whatever.
Yeah, the Catholic definition is to will the good of the other. It's an act of the will. It's not a sentiment. It's not an emotion. It's not a feeling, although those physical aspects, they accompany love, but they're not what love is. Otherwise, it would make no sense for Christ to have commanded us to love our neighbor. We can't be commanded to feel a certain way, or to like someone, or to have good chemistry with someone, right?
Yeah, so on that level, the Buddha talked about 4 different factors or aspects. The Buddha talks about metta or maitri, commonly translated as loving kindness, and there's like a loving kindness meditation. It's really popular, this loving kindness meditation. So when he talks about metta or maitri, he talks about universal friendship, because metta or maitri comes from the word friendship. So it's kind of like a fraternal love that you have for all beings. You kind of have to recognize that in the same way that I like to be well, happy, comfortable, and peaceful, and other beings don't like to be sick, don't like to suffer, don't like to feel pain, they're just like me. They have these tendencies. So I have to try to protect them. The Buddha gives an example like a mother wants to protect her only child. In the similar way, we have to have this kind of metta for all beings in the universe, from, the smallest roach and ant to like the biggest elephant or whale, or to even beings that we're not aware of that might exist in other places, in other realms. Even the beings in hell, we should care about them. The next step is called karuna. Karuna, I guess the best word we can use is like compassion. So you see other beings suffering and you want to do something about it, and you do something about it. You help them. You try to help them. That's the next step. The third step is mudita. Mudita means being happy for others when goodness comes their way. So a lot of people in the West are like jealous of their neighbors. They're always trying to keep up with the Jones and stuff like that. So the Buddha says that's not good. Anytime someone, does something good and they get rewarded for it, we should be happy for them. That's the third one. And the last one is upekkha or upeksha, and that's equanimity. So equanimity doesn't mean like you're totally detached from the situation. That's not the kind of equanimity the Buddha's talking about, but he's talking about having a tranquil, calm, harmonious perspective on how things really are. And when you have that clear mind, you won't be judgmental. You won't have all these other things because you're in a tranquil, wholesome state of mind, a complete state of mind.
Very good. It all sounds good, and it all sounds very, very Catholic. I want to talk a little bit about origins. Does Buddhism talk about origins of where do you come from and where did, this whole cause and effect chain? Is this one of the questions that was ignored by Buddha?
Yeah, he ignored that question because it said it doesn't lead to the end of suffering. But later, there's kind of like little things that are left behind that people use to say, oh, the Buddha did talk about creation because, back in the colonial times, Buddhists wanted to justify themselves to Christians, so they looked at particular suttas and interpreted them a certain way. So there is one sutta in the long discourses where it talks about how one universe was created and how beings arose in that one universe. But that's just the context to the story. It's not what the story is about. But people have used that particular sutra, that discourse, to say, oh, Buddha does talk about the origin of the physical world. But the Buddha was, from what I understand, he was not at all concerned about where this physical world came from. He's more concerned about how this belief that we are here, how that arose. So there's one particular sutra, one discourse, where an angel comes to question the Buddha to see if he's really the Buddha. And he tells him, is there an end to the world? And then the Buddha says, no, there's no end to the world. The angel goes, that's true, because in my previous life, I was a yogi. I had psychic powers. I traveled through space very fast, and I went as far as I could in 100 years. I didn't see an end. So then the Buddha said, although I said there's no end to the world, you can't conquer suffering until you find the end of the world. So at first, that sounds like paradox, and sometimes people think, oh, Buddhists are happy with paradox, but that's not true. Buddhists are not satisfied with paradox. We just have to switch levels now. So we switch levels, and the Buddha says, it is here in this fathom-long body with its perceptions and conceptions that I declare the beginning of the world, and the end of the world. So what this angel was trying to do was trying to find out if there was an end to this physical universe, if there's somewhere, we can travel in space far enough and get out, try to escape it materially. But the Buddha says, no, there's no way you can get out of it that way. You have to look inside and realize that you yourself have created the world that you've existed in. And that's the only way to be free.
I still have not understood how many beings there really and truly and actually are. If you and I are two or if we're one, can you just really briefly tell me what the case is in your understanding?
On this level, everyone's an individual. There's several different beings on this level.
But on other levels?
Well, if you realize what the Buddha's been telling us, that we, through personalizing these experiences of sensations and emotions and conceptions and all these other things that we do, that we fabricate, if you break it down, you'll see that there was no one there in the beginning to exist. That you created yourself, basically. It's like a delusion.
If you achieve your goal and you escape samsara, and if Buddha has escaped samsara, will there then be two of you? Will you meet each other outside of samsara, or does that question not make any sense at all?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense because it supposes that there's a me and then there was a Buddha, when the Buddha said there is no true essential person here to begin with. So we can't talk about entities in that kind of level. We can only talk about activities, and all activities cease to be personalized on that level. So there's just components left over within samsara, but no one to own them. But the material world and all that stuff might still be there. He doesn't say yes or no. It might be there, but that's not his concern. He wants to break down this illusion that we're in. That's his main concern.
Would it be a good thing or a bad thing if every being that can escape samsara did escape samsara? Is that a good thing or bad thing? And can you describe what that might mean?
I can't understand how that would happen, but it would be good.
So you are a monk, is that correct?
Yes, I'm a monk.
And how many years or months have you been a monk?
So there's two different levels. There's Samanera monk, which is a monk in training, and then there's full monk, bhikkhu. So there's two levels. I've been a Samanera monk for a little over 2 years, and I'm waiting to go to Sri Lanka to get my higher ordination. The reason I haven't done that is because I was finishing up my religious degree. So my teacher said, get your school done, and then we'll send you over there.
The foreign words that you've used in this interview, are they all Sri Lankan?
They're all Pali. Pali, the word itself literally means text. So that system of language is what scholars call now Magadha. Magadha was a kingdom, the most powerful kingdom in the time of the Buddha. And since the Buddhist kingdom of the Sakyans was very close to Magadha next door, they most likely, scholars think, that they spoke a form of Magadhi. So we say Pali, everywhere you look, it'll say the Buddha spoke Pali, everything about Pali, but Pali is just what we call it now. But back then it could have been known something like Magadhi, the language of, the language of those people at that time in that country.
In today's geography, where on the map is that?
It would be on the eastern part of India near the Ganges River.
And can you tell the listeners what the name of your brand of Buddhism is?
I was ordained as a Theravada Buddhist monk. Thera meaning elder, Vada meaning way. This school holds to what we know as the most conservative or original teachings of the Buddha. Within that, particularly, this school comes from Sri Lanka. So there's Theravada monks in Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, different parts. But this particular group that I'm here with, these monks are from Sri Lanka.
Did you handpick that because you were drawn to its teachings?
I tried other kinds of Buddhism, but that one particular monk that I told you about, Venerable Dr. Punaji Mahatera, the way he presented it to me, it resonated with me. So this is the school that I followed because I just felt experientially that it was what connected with me the most.
And how far could you bend your beliefs until someone tapped you on the shoulder and said, you're getting out of line with your Buddhism? If you said, well, I believe that there's only one lifetime and then there's either eternal hell or eternal heaven, would you raise some eyebrows in your community?
Yeah, I'd raise some eyebrows, but it wouldn't get me kicked out from being a monk because there really is no things you're forced to believe. There's things that you should practice, especially for monks. There's a disciplinary rules that you have to do, and if you don't do them, you're not a monk. But as far as believing goes, the ideas in your head, there's no thing about ideas.
Right. So just to wrap up the show, what would you say to anyone out there that's listening now?
If you know anything from your experience in this world, is that nothing lasts forever. Nothing lasts forever, not even the worst time. So you can take refuge in this kind of flux and impermanent state of the world. Good times are coming. You just have to endure. You have to be diligent, and you will make it. You have the strength, and this too will pass.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.